I'd like to give thanks to all of you for being here today. I'd like to give thanks to my ancestors and yours for the paths they paved to bring us to this moment. I would like to give thanks to my higher power and yours for sustaining us in times of trial and enabling us to reach this season. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge that we gather together today on stolen land, where not too far from here, people remain imprisoned and enslaved. I ask for their forgiveness, and forgiveness from the Lenape people, the original stewards of this land. I orient myself toward forgiveness, knowing that in begging their pardon, I am asking for a blessing I myself have denied to others. For those who I've yet to forgive, I ask your forgiveness as well. I'm here today, in case that intro wasn't clear, to talk about forgiveness. And not just forgiveness, but radical forgiveness. And before I can really explain what that is, I just want to tell you about the first time I experienced radical forgiveness for myself. In 2011, I was sitting in a diner, waiting to go in for an interview that I knew had the capacity to change my life forever. It was the opportunity that would bring me to New York, introduce me professionally to the Broadway community, and roll out the red carpet for my gender transition, literally. It was a tremendous invitation to step up to the dream of who I wanted to be in the world. And I sat in that diner, and I prayed for my life to change, but at the same time, I battled every demon voice in my head telling me that I was unworthy. How many of you know that conundrum, right? And then I wrote in my journal in big block letters across an entire page of the journal, "Now is the time to practice radical forgiveness." And I didn't even know what it meant at first. I just knew this. In my life, there are two forces that are almost guaranteed to wedge themselves between who I am and who I want to be in the world. And for me, those two forces are my own attachments to shame and anger. Now, let me tell you a little bit about how shame and anger have manifested in my life. How many of you know what this feels like? Cool, great. I'm a survivor of abuse, sure, but also of this unique kind of pain that comes from living in the world as a transgender person before we had the common knowledge to understand or label that experience. I have a solo show called Manifest Pussy. I don't know if any of you have seen it. It's like an autobiographical rock odyssey, kind of like Hedwig, but real. And in that show, I sing this song by Julianne Wick-Davis about the first time I ever wore a dress. So spoiler alert, I was 6, it was at a Super Bowl party, and it did not end well. Okay? So all these little girls were playing dress up, and I didn't understand why no one else at that party saw me as the little girl that I knew that I was. And like I say in the song, the first time I felt pretty was the first time I felt shame. Anger, I learned about by forcing myself through a gay boy's adolescence at the dawn of the queer youth movement, when high school was a battleground and the nightly news a snuff reel, a moralistic snuff reel of our would-be elders dying from the plague. I was bullied every day from 6th grade to 12th grade, so that's 7 years. I dropped out of 2 high schools, 2 continuation schools, and did a little stint in a mental institution, but it was the 90s. So. I wanted to be a riot girl. You know, I made zines. I wrote slam poetry and worn-out composition books. I still write slam poetry and worn-out composition books, actually. Like I said, I'm a survivor. And in my pain, I know that I have hurt others. So that cycle of shame and guilt just spun its way on through my 20s. And it's not that I wasn't creating. I was being creative, but always with a bruise on my heart and a chip on my shoulder. And then I found myself in that diner. And I had invoked some random words about radical forgiveness that I didn't even really understand, but suddenly I felt everything, all my shame and all my anger just drop. And you know, I nailed that interview. I booked that fellowship. I moved to New York. I started a theater company. I began my transition, and I became an actress, all because in that one moment, I decided to forgive myself and everybody else. Radical forgiveness is a liberatory practice. It actually releases you, spiritually at least. And the idea of forgiveness as spiritual liberation is not new. For over 5,000 years, the Jewish people have gathered together on the holiest day of the year to make atonement before God, and the forgiveness of God inscribes them for another year in the book of life. In Christianity, it is Jesus' sacrifice on the cross that allows God's grace to come down onto his followers, Christ's blood shed for the forgiveness of our sins. In Islam, the prophet teaches us that to avenge evil only begets more evil. But forgiveness and amends are rewarded by God. And in Buddhism, it is only possible to relieve yourself from the grasping at animosity and resentment if you offer appreciation as awareness. But what makes it radical? Well, the kind of forgiveness that I experienced in that diner was a kind of forgiveness that was absolute, that was instantaneous, and was irreversible. It was absolute because it was that kind of forgiveness that somehow seemed to cover every act I had ever done or would ever do, or every act that had ever been done to me or would ever be done to me. It was instantaneous because it was the kind of forgiveness that seemed to arrive suddenly and all at once. And it was irreversible because it was the kind of forgiveness that made itself known. And once it had made itself known, it could not be unknown. But it can be forgotten. So that shame and anger, that's like always right here, ready for me to pick it back up and put it back on. And I don't know about you guys, but I don't have time in my life to dig through the baggage I've been carrying around like I've forgotten to pack something, right? I know what's in there. I carry that close. But here's what radical forgiveness is like, all right? You know, at the airport, there's always that announcement over the PA that's like, unintended baggage will be confiscated and destroyed. I do not know why my airport was like 1940s radio hour, but that's fine. So I don't recommend doing this in an airport, but metaphorically, imagine if you could just leave your baggage unattended, right? And then suddenly, everything that you've been carrying around all day or all week or all of your adult life maybe is just like swept up and blown away. And you didn't have to do anything but forgive. Now, it's symbolic, and it's a practice, and it doesn't negate the need for justice or accountability. But it's kind of like an internal recalibration that will orient you toward your most compassionate self. And of course, there may be people that we're not ready or willing to forgive, just like there may be people whose forgiveness we'll never be able to ask for or from whom it might never be granted. But when you experience yourself as absolutely, instantaneously, and irreversibly forgiven, it makes forgiving other people a whole lot easier. And that's why I like to think of it as a practice. I think that radical forgiveness is something you can commit to trying. So let me bring it back just to one more tangible example for you. I recently finished shooting the series finale of Amazon's Transparent. Yes. It's a big movie musical, comes out on Friday, and I got to be a writer and a producer on it too, so it was like a total dream. And I want to start by saying that I love and respect everyone involved in that movie that we made together. But I also want to say that I believe you can love a piece of art and still be critical of the mechanisms by which it was made. Thank you for the snaps. So, as a transgender woman, my relationship to Transparent was complicated. I love that it broke ground for trans storytelling on television, and I understand that the only way they could get the show made was by casting a famous cisgender actor in a transgender role. But I have also gone on the record many times in this community advocating for the importance of transgender representation, especially in casting. Yeah. And then the allegations. leveled at this actor from 4 women, 3 of them trans, 2 on the show, and the investigation that got him fired. And now I'm supposed to show up and fill these shoes, symbolically at least, of this matriarch of trans representation and work with a creative team whose decisions inspired me, yes, but also really upset me. So I'm getting the career opportunity of a lifetime, but only because 4 women were sexually harassed, 1 man lost his job, and an internationally beloved show was going off the air. So for someone with a predisposition to shame, this was somehow all my fault. I had watched as Trace Lissette came forward bravely and seen how her name was dragged through the mud by powerful cisgender people in our industry. And we had followed each other on the socials for years, but the first time we met, it was still up in the air as to whether or not she'd be coming back for the show. And I told her, I said, if you don't come back, it's our loss. But if you come back, the show ends on our terms. And I apologized to her on behalf of someone I had never met because I needed her blessing to step into the role made available to me through her trauma. And for this thing to work, we had to forgive each other a lot. And we did it all the time. The very first time the principal cast got back together was at a workshop down at Musical Theater Factory, and we sat around in a circle and apologized to one another. Me for my resentments, others for the lack of awareness that brought the show to the brink. But I think the clearest example of how I practiced radical forgiveness in the context of that creative process was the day that I got to play this icon of trans representation in her life before transition. And I walked to set with my chest bound, dressed as a man, carrying the weight and the repression that I knew all too well. And I had to take this deep breath, and I had to ask forgiveness from every person who I may have harmed during the time in which I was wrestling against the body that I felt trapped in. For the ways that I had unleashed my anger unfairly or forced my will upon others. And then I had to believe in my heart that that forgiveness was granted. And of course, I had to extend that same forgiveness to anyone who had ever wronged me. How else could I step on set, stand in front of that camera, and allow myself to be seen? It's symbolic, but I think practicing radical forgiveness is absolutely essential if you want to show up in the world who you are, unencumbered by shame and anger. And it's really easy. You want to try it with me? Cool. So I invite you all to close your eyes, or not. I will. And we're just going to take a deep breath together. And when you breathe in, I want you to imagine that you're asking forgiveness from anyone you've ever wronged, intentionally or otherwise. And then hold that breath. And as you hold that breath, imagine that you're receiving their forgiveness. Feel their forgiveness wash over you. And then, as you exhale, imagine that you're sharing that forgiveness with everyone you've ever wronged, intentionally or otherwise. And now open your eyes. I believe in the power of saying I'm sorry. But for some reason, those are 2 of the hardest words for us to say. Same with I forgive you. But when you practice radical forgiveness, saying those words almost becomes second nature. You're saying them inside all the time. You're secretly absolving everybody on the subway. So I invite you to practice radical forgiveness in your daily life, in your personal life, in your creative work, and why not, even in your politics. Yeah. But I offer up this thought that maybe our politics are only as radical as our forgiveness. If we're really creating the future together, then we need to change the way we relate and respond to one another. So let's practice creating a world where we can liberate one another from shame and anger, where we are radically forgiven and can radically forgive. Thank you.